He walked into his restaurant expecting a quiet lunch, but everything changed the moment he saw three little girls being forced out of the place he thought he controlled. Henry Winslow walked into his flagship restaurant with the same confident precision that defined every part of his life. He wasn't just the CEO of a luxury dining empire, he was its architect, its heartbeat, and its untouchable face. With his sharp navy suit, crisp white shirt, and a gold watch peeking from beneath his cuff, he looked exactly like the kind of man who never made time for accidents. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his blue eyes alert but cool, and every movement seemed measured, purposeful. He had come in for a routine lunch before an investor meeting across town, expecting nothing more than his usual quiet corner table, a seared salmon with lemon risotto, and 15 uninterrupted minutes of control. The restaurant staff moved quickly when he entered, offering polite nods and subtle signs of recognition. No one spoke unless spoken to, just how Henry liked it. The manager guided him to his usual seat by the window, where the view overlooked the city's bustling street. He pulled out his phone to scan emails as the waiter approached, but then something distracted him. There was a shift in tone across the dining room, low voices, tense whispers, a sudden awkward silence that made him look up from his screen. At first, he didn't think much of it. But then he saw a commotion at the far end of the restaurant, near the less formal seating area by the glass doors. Three small girls, seated at a table that had clearly not been assigned to them, were surrounded by a hostess and a nervous-looking waitress. The staff were not being cruel, but they were firm. The girls looked out of place in a setting like this, wearing mismatched pink jackets and white cotton dresses, their blonde braids slightly undone, their shoes scuffed and damp from the street. They hadn't ordered anything. One of them clutched a dollar bill in her small hand, the other held an apple, and the third simply stared down at her empty place setting with wide, solemn eyes. The manager was approaching them now, likely to ask them to leave. Henry narrowed his eyes. Something about the way the smallest girl gripped her sister's arm made him stand up before he realized he was moving. He crossed the restaurant slowly, aware of the sudden quiet behind him, aware that the entire staff was watching. As he approached the table, the girls looked up. They were identical in face, triplets, it seemed, and each had the same piercing blue eyes. But there was something in those eyes that froze him. Not fear. Not mischief. Something else. Recognition. He wasn't sure. Before anyone could speak, one of the girls said softly, "Our mom told us to come here. She said our dad is the man who owns this place." The room went still. Henry stared at her, heart thudding once in his chest like a warning bell. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The staff looked to him for a signal. The girls looked to him for an answer. And for the first time in years, Henry Winslow had no idea what to say. The silence that followed the girls' words lingered heavier than any he'd ever experienced in a boardroom. Henry stood still, staring at the three little girls in front of him, their identical faces filled with something that didn't fit in this gleaming, high-end restaurant, something raw, unfiltered, and real. He could feel the eyes of his staff and several patrons glued to the scene, but none of that mattered. All that existed in that moment was the small, determined voice of the child who had just claimed to be his daughter. His mind raced for logic, but instead, memory flooded in, one he hadn't allowed himself to think about in years. Clara. The name hit him like a wave. 7 years ago, she had vanished from his life without explanation. One day she had been there, laughing in his kitchen, whispering plans about the future, and the next she was gone. She had never returned his calls. Never responded to his letters. At first, he had been angry, then devastated, and eventually, he buried her in the part of his heart he didn't allow anyone to touch. He hadn't known she was pregnant. He hadn't even known she had left the city. And now, right in front of him, were three undeniable reflections of her, blonde like she was, their eyes almost identical to his own. He took a slow breath and crouched down to their level, careful not to frighten them. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "I'm Sophie," the one with the dollar said. The second girl, the one with the apple, said, "I'm Grace." The third, quieter, murmured, "I'm Layla." Henry nodded, trying to keep his voice steady. "And your mom, her name was Clara?" All three nodded. Sophie added, "She got really sick. We don't live far. But when she got worse, she told us to come here. She said, if anything happens, find the man who runs that restaurant. He's your dad." Her voice cracked at the end, and Henry felt something collapse inside him. He stood and looked at the staff, who were now frozen in place, unsure of what to do. "It's fine," he said quietly. "They're staying." He motioned to the table beside his usual spot. "Get them something warm. Whatever they want. And tell the kitchen to take care of it personally." No one questioned him. The girls moved to the new table, hesitating slightly until he reached out and gently placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder. It was enough. They sat, still holding their small treasures, $1, one apple, as if letting go of them might make everything too real. As they began to eat, Henry sat across from them, watching each small movement with disbelief and growing awe. He asked gentle questions, careful not to overwhelm them. They told him about Clara's illness, about the neighbor who was watching them while she was in the hospital. They didn't know she had fallen into a coma. They thought she was resting. When they said it, his breath caught in his throat. He realized these girls had come here out of love and trust, not desperation. They believed in the story their mother told them, believed enough to find a stranger in a suit and call him their father. He tried to imagine how Clara must have felt, knowing her time was running out, choosing to send her daughters to the one person she thought might protect them. It broke him to think of her facing that decision alone. And it broke him more to realize that in all his years of building empires, negotiating billion-dollar deals, and conquering headlines, he had missed the most important moment of his life, the moment he became a father. By the time dessert arrived, the girls were laughing softly, their hands sticky with melted chocolate, their eyes brighter. They trusted him with the ease only children could give. And for the first time since Clara disappeared, Henry felt something real click back into place inside him, not guilt, not regret, but responsibility. A pull stronger than ambition, deeper than fear. He didn't know what came next, but he knew this, he wasn't going to walk away again. Henry didn't return to the office that day. His assistant called twice, and he ignored both. Instead, he rode with the girls in the back of a town car, their tiny voices filling the air with hesitant questions and whispers. They gave him directions back to the apartment where they were temporarily staying with a woman named Mrs. Elkins, a retired nurse who had lived next door to Clara for years. When they arrived, Mrs. Elkins opened the door with a worried look on her face that softened the moment she saw the girls safe and smiling. But her eyes shifted quickly to Henry, widening with recognition and a sharp trace of disbelief. "You're him," she said, not as a question but a quiet revelation. "You're Henry." He nodded, offering a quiet hello. She didn't scold him. She didn't need to. There was something in her expression, equal parts sorrow and exhausted relief, that said enough. She invited him in and handed him a box almost immediately. It was worn around the edges, with Clara's name scrawled across the top in her familiar handwriting. "She asked me to give you this if something ever happened," Mrs. Elkins said, and then stepped into the kitchen to give them space. Henry sat down on the worn couch, the girls curled beside him, and lifted the lid. Inside were photographs, old notes, drawings in crayon labeled "Mommy and Me," and a sealed envelope with his name on it. His breath caught as he opened it. Clara's handwriting poured across the page, uneven and faded in places, as if she had written it in pain. She explained how she had found out she was pregnant after they separated, how she had tried to contact him but never received a response, how she eventually gave up and chose to raise the girls alone. She told him how proud she was of them, how much they looked like him when they smiled. She wrote that if he was reading the letter, it meant she hadn't made it through. And she asked, no, begged, that he take care of them if he could, that he at least try. Henry closed his eyes and gripped the letter tightly, his throat aching. He had built a world where control and order shielded him from the unknown, from mess, from emotion. But none of that mattered now. What mattered were the 3 children beside him, looking up at him not as a CEO, not as a stranger, but as the man their mother had trusted above anyone else. He looked down at them and said, with quiet certainty, "I'm not going anywhere." The next hours moved quickly. He contacted his lawyer to begin emergency guardianship paperwork. He spoke with Mrs. Elkins about keeping the girls comfortable until arrangements could be made. He arranged for a pediatrician to visit. And later, after the girls had fallen asleep under a blanket on the couch, he sat in silence, the open box still on his lap, the weight of it pressing deep into his chest. For the first time in years, his mind didn't race with numbers or deadlines. It stayed focused on a single truth: these girls were his. Not just biologically, not just legally, but wholly and completely. He had missed their first steps, their first words, the early birthdays and scraped knees, but he wouldn't miss another moment if he could help it. Clara had given him a gift wrapped in heartbreak, and he would honor it the only way he knew how, by showing up, fully, every single day. When he finally left the apartment that night, he didn't return to his penthouse. Instead, he checked into a hotel near the girls, unwilling to be far. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail of the day in his mind, feeling every beat of it settle deeper into his soul. Something inside him had changed. Irrevocably. And he didn't want to undo it. Not now. Not ever. The following morning arrived before Henry had closed his eyes. Sleep had been elusive, not because of discomfort, but because his mind couldn't settle. Every image from the day before looped in his thoughts: the girl's small hands, the letter from Clara, the sound of Sophie's voice when she said, "She told us you were our dad." He had known pressure before, he had made decisions that shifted markets, but this was different. This was something far more intimate, something that demanded not sharpness or power, but softness, presence, and heart. By sunrise, he was already showered and dressed, not in a suit but in jeans and a sweater that hadn't left his closet in years. He needed to be someone else now, or maybe he just needed to be more of who he once was, long before all the layers of success covered everything that mattered. He stopped at a small bakery on the way to the apartment and bought warm croissants, fresh orange juice, and a bag of chocolate chip cookies after remembering Grace had said they were her favorite. The air was cold but light, and the streets were still quiet when he reached the familiar door. Mrs. Elkins opened it with a soft smile and nodded without words, stepping aside as if he belonged there already. The girls were still asleep on the couch, curled in different directions under the same quilt, one foot sticking out, one hand clutching a worn stuffed rabbit. He sat in the kitchen with Mrs. Elkins, who poured him coffee and said softly, "They've been through more than they show." Henry nodded, knowing words weren't enough to answer her truth. When the girls finally woke, it was Layla who noticed him first. She sat up slowly, rubbed her eyes, and gave him a sleepy grin. "You're still here," she whispered, as if she had dreamed him and wasn't sure it was real. "I told you I would be," he replied gently. One by one, they shuffled into the kitchen, where the smell of croissants and the sight of real juice made their eyes widen. It was a simple breakfast, but it felt like a feast. They ate in near silence, but it wasn't awkward, it was comfort. It was warmth. And it was new. After breakfast, Henry asked if he could take them to the park. The idea lit up their faces in a way that tightened his throat. He called his driver to bring a car, but when the girls said they liked walking better, he cancelled it and they walked, hand in hand, 3 small sets of fingers tangled in his. At the park, they ran across the frost-covered grass, climbed the jungle gym, and asked him to push them on the swings. He did, laughing for the first time in what felt like years. He pushed them higher and higher, and they screamed with joy, shouting, "Higher, Dad," until the word pierced him like sunlight. None of them noticed the people passing by or the looks from strangers. For a moment, they were just a man and 3 little girls who belonged to him in a way deeper than words. Later, they sat on a bench with cheeks flushed from cold air and smiles that hadn't left their faces. Layla asked if he had a house. He said yes. Grace asked if there were rooms for all of them. He said there could be. Sophie was quiet until she said, "Can we go there someday?" He didn't hesitate. "You'll go there soon," he said, voice steady. "As soon as we make sure everything is safe and right." They nodded like they understood more than children should have to. That evening, after the girls had gone to bed, Henry sat again in the living room with Mrs. Elkins and asked about Clara. The older woman shared pieces of the story he hadn't heard, the slow decline in Clara's health, the strength she carried in silence, her refusal to let the girls see how much pain she was in. She had worked from home as long as she could, had sold her jewelry to pay rent, had walked the girls to school even when she was too weak. "She never said a word against you," Mrs. Elkins added softly. "She just wanted them to have a chance to know who you were." Henry stared at the floor, guilt thick in his chest, but also something else, resolve. He couldn't change the past, couldn't fix what had been lost, but he could write what came next. And that, he realized, was everything. Before he left that night, he kissed each girl's forehead as they slept and whispered promises he meant to keep. He would return tomorrow. And the next day. And the day after that. Because he wasn't just their father by name. He was ready to become it in every sense. Henry began rearranging his life one quiet decision at a time. He didn't make grand announcements or dramatic exits from the business world. Instead, he shifted meetings to the early morning so he could spend afternoons with the girls. He handed off more responsibility to his executive team, who looked surprised but relieved, and he started showing up late on purpose just so he wouldn't have to rush out of breakfast with them. He had spent so many years building his image around control and authority that he had forgotten what it felt like to be needed without performance. Now, he was discovering a different kind of purpose, one that came with sticky fingers, sudden questions about animals, and the sharp ache of knowing how much time he had already lost. The girls had begun to let him in without hesitation, though he still saw the hesitation in himself. Sophie was the leader of the three, cautious but fiercely protective. She often watched him with her mother's eyes, evaluating his promises before she believed them. Grace was quieter, more thoughtful, prone to long silences that ended in brilliant, unexpected insights. Layla was all emotion, quick to laugh, quick to cry, and always the first to reach for his hand. They had memorized his rhythm within days, adapting with a grace he didn't understand but deeply admired. On Wednesday, he picked them up from school for the first time. They ran toward him without fear, their backpacks bouncing, their smiles wide. Other parents watched curiously, perhaps recognizing him from news headlines or wondering how someone in a cashmere coat fit into the schoolyard. But the girls didn't care, and neither did he. In that moment, as they grabbed his hands and told him about art class and snack time and a classmate named Ava who had a hamster named Waffles, he realized he had never felt more real. Back at the apartment, they pulled him into their world completely. He learned the names of their stuffed animals. He built a blanket fort in the living room that they declared a secret spy cave. He read 3 chapters of a book he had never heard of, using silly voices that made them collapse into laughter. And when it was time for bed, they asked him to stay. He tucked them in, turned off the light, then sat outside the door for nearly an hour just to be sure they slept soundly. Later that night, he called Clara's doctor. The hospital had sent her medical records at his request, and he wanted to understand everything. The conversation was clinical, respectful, but it shook him. She had known for months. She had fought for every extra week. She had declined aggressive treatment not because she gave up, but because she wanted to be clear-headed and present for her girls. She had written letters to them. She had left notes inside books. She had stitched herself into their lives so they would never forget her. And then, quietly, she had sent them to him, her last leap of faith. Henry didn't sleep that night. He sat by the window and stared out at the city lights, thinking about what it meant to be chosen like that. Clara hadn't asked for help until the end, and even then, she hadn't demanded anything. She had simply trusted him to do the right thing, to show up, to love them. He thought about the years he had spent avoiding vulnerability, choosing detachment over risk, ambition over connection. None of it meant anything now if he failed these girls. So, he made a decision. He would not just provide. He would not just visit and supervise and schedule. He would become their home. He would move them out of the temporary space, into somewhere filled with light and warmth and safety. He would give them consistency, patience, love. And he would do it not because of guilt or obligation, but because he wanted to. Because when Grace whispered, "Good night, Daddy," for the first time, he didn't want to cry. He wanted to earn it. Every single day. The move happened on a Sunday morning, quiet and unceremonious, but full of emotion beneath the surface. Henry had spent the previous week preparing everything with meticulous care, not the kind of careful planning he used for business mergers or investor meetings, but something far more personal. He had hired decorators, but only after asking each of the girls what color they wanted in their rooms, what kind of bed they preferred, what books they loved most. He took their drawings and framed them. He stocked the kitchen with their favorite cereals, the kind with too much sugar, and even labeled the shelves with their names. It wasn't perfect. It didn't feel like a home yet. But it felt ready to become one. When the girls arrived at the new apartment, a spacious corner unit filled with soft morning light, they stood in the entryway silently, unsure of whether they were allowed to be excited. Henry didn't say anything at first. He just set down their bags, knelt in front of them, and said, "This is yours now. Every part of it. Your home." That was when Layla ran into the living room and shouted, "I call the window seat." Sophie opened every door with purpose, checking each room before nodding in quiet approval. Grace walked slowly, her fingers brushing against the walls, as if trying to memorize the space. They found their rooms, their books, their beds. Then they found him again and didn't let go for a long time. The next few days were a blur of settling in, school drop-offs, unpacking boxes, learning how to braid hair without tangling it, arguing over pajamas, and discovering that the dishwasher made a strange beeping sound every 20 minutes. Henry learned to wake up earlier than usual so he could sit with them at breakfast. He started writing little notes and hiding them in their lunchboxes, even though he felt foolish at first. The girls would return in the afternoon waving the notes like they were golden tickets. They had inside jokes now, silly songs for brushing teeth, a rule that Friday nights were for popcorn and movies on the floor. Slowly, the space between them disappeared. But underneath the laughter and newness, there were still moments of silence that stretched too long. Once, Henry found Grace staring at a photo of Clara in her room. She didn't cry. She just held the frame in her lap and said, "Sometimes I forget what her voice sounded like." Henry sat beside her and said, "Then we'll remember it together." He played the one voicemail Clara had left him, the one he had saved years ago without knowing why. It was her saying something ordinary, something about forgetting a book at his place. But her voice was there. And for Grace, that was everything. Sophie, ever the quiet one, had trouble sleeping in the new place. Henry noticed her wandering the hallway at night, blanket wrapped around her shoulders. He didn't ask questions. He just made space for her on the couch and let her fall asleep beside him, sometimes with his arm around her, sometimes with just silence. Layla, on the other hand, began calling him Dad more consistently now, not in big moments, but in passing, "Dad, can I have more juice?" or "Dad, I forgot my math folder." Each time, it hit him with unexpected force. He would nod, answer normally, then later step into his room and sit on the edge of the bed, stunned by the quiet miracle of it. It wasn't all easy. There were tantrums, forgotten homework, missed calls from work, and days when Henry felt completely unequipped. There were times when he doubted himself, when the weight of what he'd missed nearly crushed him. But then there were moments like watching the girls dance in the living room in socks and pajamas, or hearing them shout his name when he walked in the door, or seeing Grace draw a picture of their new home with all four of them in it, labeled "Us." Those moments rewrote everything he thought he knew about what mattered. One evening, as he tucked them in, Sophie asked, are you going to stay forever? Henry looked at her, at all three of them, and said, I'll stay for every single forever you need. He kissed each of them goodnight, turned off the light and stood in the doorway for a moment longer than he needed to, listening to the soft breaths of the daughters he had almost lost and now couldn't imagine life without. Spring crept in without ceremony, transforming the city streets with soft sunlight and the faint blush of blossoms on the trees. For Henry, the season brought with it a sense of calm he hadn't realized he was craving. Life had become beautifully ordinary. Gone were the sterile evenings filled with silence and emails. Now, his days began with the hum of morning cartoons, the chaos of packing school lunches, and tiny feet running across hardwood floors. The girls had settled into a rhythm that felt like they had always lived there. Their laughter filled the apartment in unexpected waves, turning it from a place to sleep into a place that felt alive. Each of the girls had found their own way of growing within this new life. Sophie took to organizing things, books, shoes, even breakfast cereal. She liked to feel in control, and Henry understood that came from wanting to hold together a world that once felt like it was falling apart. Grace began writing poems, quietly scribbling them in notebooks and leaving them in different corners of the house for someone to find. Her words were simple, soft, and honest in a way that broke Henry's heart and mended it at the same time. Layla never stopped asking questions, about the moon, about how coffee worked, about whether penguins could be kept as pets. Henry answered every single one, even when he didn't know the answers, because what mattered most was that she trusted him enough to ask. They started a new tradition every Sunday, brunch followed by a walk to the bookstore, where each girl got to pick one thing, even if it wasn't a book. One morning, as they stood in line to pay, the cashier looked at Henry and the girls and smiled, saying, "You've got your hands full." Without thinking, Henry replied, "Yeah, full of everything I never knew I needed." The girls didn't notice the weight of that sentence, but he did. He felt it linger inside him as they walked home hand in hand. That week, Sophie had a school project about families. Each student had to present a photo of their home life and explain who they lived with. Henry offered to take a new picture, and they posed in the kitchen, flour on their cheeks from a failed batch of pancakes, smiles too wide to be forced. When Sophie stood at the front of the classroom to present, she pointed at the photo and said, "This is me, my sisters, and my dad." He didn't know we were his at first. But he came anyway. And he stayed. That's what makes a real family. Henry, standing in the back with the other parents, had to turn his head and wipe his eyes before anyone noticed. Later that evening, while folding laundry, Grace came in holding one of her poems. She didn't say anything, just placed it beside him and left the room. He picked it up and read it slowly. The poem was titled Promise, and it ended with the line, "He didn't say forever." But he meant it anyway. Henry closed his eyes and held the page to his chest. He wasn't a man of poetry, not before, but that one line felt more honest than any contract he had ever signed. As the girls got ready for bed that night, Henry watched them dance around their rooms in mismatched pajamas, brushing teeth to silly songs, and giggling about something only they understood. The apartment buzzed with a quiet magic that had nothing to do with design or luxury. It came from the presence of something Henry had lived most of his life without, unconditional love. Love that didn't need to be earned or explained or justified. It was simply there, wrapped in tiny arms and late-night stories and the steady trust of three girls who believed in him more than he had ever believed in himself. After they were asleep, Henry stood alone in the hallway, looking down the line of open doors, each one softly lit from within. He thought about Clara, about how she had raised them alone, how much courage it must have taken to send them to him with nothing more than a note and a prayer. He whispered into the quiet, "Thank you," not knowing if she could hear it, but needing to say it anyway. Because even in her absence, she had given him the one thing he never thought he could have, a family. And he was going to protect it with everything he had left. The 1-year mark arrived quietly, without fanfare or announcement, just the way Clara would have wanted it. Henry had planned nothing elaborate, though he had thought about it for weeks, unsure whether to let the day pass like any other or to acknowledge it in some meaningful way. In the end, he chose something simple. He told the girls they were taking the day off from school and work, and they would spend it together, outside, away from routines and obligations. He didn't call it an anniversary or try to explain its weight to them. He just said, let's go somewhere she would have loved, and they understood without needing more. They drove to a quiet meadow outside the city where wildflowers had just begun to bloom. The air was clean and cool, filled with the kind of stillness that felt sacred. Henry had packed a picnic, the girls' favorite sandwiches, a chocolate cake, and a thermos of tea, and they laid everything out on a blanket beneath a wide tree. Grace brought along a small framed photo of Clara and placed it gently in the center, like a guest of honor. Sophie held a folded letter she had written and didn't speak for a long time, just kept glancing down at it as if waiting for the right moment. Layla carried a bouquet of wildflowers, clutched tightly in her small hands. After they ate, Henry invited them to share stories, and the girls each took a turn. Grace remembered how Clara used to hum a lullaby that had no words but always made her feel safe. Layla talked about how Clara would let them wear her scarves and call it a fashion show, even on days she was too tired to stand. Sophie finally read her letter aloud, voice shaking but strong. In it, she thanked Clara for everything, for loving them, for being brave, and for finding a way to make sure they wouldn't be alone. When she finished, Henry couldn't speak. He just reached for her hand and held it tightly. One by one, they released little pieces of paper into the wind, memories, hopes, promises, all written in crayon and pencil and folded carefully. Henry added one of his own, though he didn't read it aloud. It simply said, "I won't waste a single day you gave me." The papers lifted into the air, caught by the breeze, and floated upward until they disappeared completely. For a long moment, they sat in silence, watching the sky as if waiting for an answer that didn't need to come. There were no tears, just a quiet peace that settled in all four of them. Back at home that evening, the apartment felt the same but somehow different. There was a softness in the way the girls moved through the space, as if something invisible had shifted and made room for something new. Henry stood in the kitchen making tea while the girls curled up on the couch with a blanket and a movie. They didn't ask for toys or screen time or snacks. They just wanted to be close. He brought them warm mugs of cocoa and sat between them as they leaned into his sides, all three tucked against him as if that space had been made for them from the very beginning. As the movie ended, Layla whispered, "She'd be happy, right?" Henry looked at her, at the faces of all three girls glowing in the soft light, and answered without hesitation, "She'd be proud. Of you. Of us. Of how far we've come." Sophie rested her head on his shoulder and Grace placed her hand on top of his, fingers small but steady. In that moment, there was no room for doubt. No room for guilt or fear. Only belonging. Later, after the girls had gone to bed, Henry stood alone on the balcony, looking out at the city lights. The skyline had once been a symbol of everything he had built, his power, his status, his control. Now, it was just a backdrop to what mattered most inside those four walls behind him. He thought about all the versions of himself he had once been, the driven executive, the detached man, the one who had thought he could outrun pain with success. He didn't want to be any of those men anymore. He just wanted to be their father. That was enough. He stepped back inside, locked the door behind him, and turned off the lights. In the darkness, he moved quietly through the apartment, pausing at each of their rooms, listening to the soft breathing, watching the slow rise and fall of blankets. Then he whispered, not to anyone in particular but to the air itself, "I kept my promise." And with that, he let the quiet wrap around him, not like a weight, but like a home.